ICE agents descend on Minneapolis to root out illegal Somali immigrants.
Minnesota woke up to a shock that few cities ever expect as federal pressure suddenly turned a former sanctuary into a front line. Before dawn, airports, neighborhoods, and transit corridors were quietly flagged as security flashpoints, while Washington signaled that this was no longer a routine immigration issue. The Trump administration adopted a language and posture of domestic defense, treating organized abuse of the system as a threat that demanded force, not patience. What once appeared to be scattered cases of fraud and illegal entry now seem to federal planners as something coordinated and dangerous. And as the White House hardened its stance, one question spread across the state faster than any protest. How did Minnesota reach the point where entire networks were no longer seen as civilians, but as enemy combatants?
Operation Metro Surge marked a turning point in how the federal government chose to confront illegal immigration and organized fraud in Minnesota, as it was no longer treated as a paperwork enforcement issue, but as a coordinated security operation. Before sunrise, when winter air locked the Twin Cities into silence, federal teams moved across neighborhoods that local sanctuary policies had long shielded. The timing was deliberate because cold weather keeps people indoors and limits movement, giving agents control over streets, apartment blocks, and transit routes. What unfolded was not a symbolic sweep, but a sustained deployment designed to pressure networks that federal officials believed had grown comfortable operating in the open. Hundreds of federal agents were assigned to this surge, and many moved without visible identification as a precaution against threats and harassment that had already followed earlier operations. ICE units worked alongside other federal partners, entering residential areas with clear target lists and backup teams staged nearby. The atmosphere in these neighborhoods shifted quickly as flashing lights reflected off frozen pavement and doors were knocked before many residents had even checked the time. For the people inside those homes, the sense of protection once promised by sanctuary status vanished in minutes. Federal planners had identified the Twin Cities as a critical node, arguing that years of limited cooperation and soft enforcement had allowed criminal and immigration violations to overlap. From Washington's perspective, local systems had failed to separate vulnerable families from repeat offenders, and that failure created space for organized abuse. Operation Metro Surge was designed to close that space by restoring federal control where it believed state and city leadership had lost it. The message was clear and uncompromising, because enforcement would now be driven by federal law, not local political preferences. As the operation expanded, agents moved methodically through addresses tied to criminal records and immigration violations. Vehicles were stopped near housing complexes, and units waited patiently while checks were completed. The approach emphasized control rather than speed, as officers focused on preventing flight and confusion. In several locations, the presence of federal vehicles alone was enough to draw crowds watching from behind curtains, uncertain whether this was a brief action or the start of something much larger. Public reaction followed quickly, and it was loud. Activist groups accused the federal government of targeting communities rather than criminals, while local leaders warned of fear spreading through immigrant neighborhoods. Federal officials countered by stressing that their focus remained on individuals with prior criminal histories and outstanding violations. The divide between these two narratives widened with every arrest, turning quiet streets into symbols of a national argument over borders, authority, and control. Operation Metro Surge did not emerge in isolation because it was directly connected to a massive fraud case that had already shaken Minnesota's political landscape. During the COVID pandemic, funds intended to feed children were allegedly redirected into private pockets, exposing how easily large sums could be moved through weak oversight. Investigators described a system where paperwork replaced accountability, allowing false claims to flow unchecked for months. That failure set the stage for the current crackdown. According to court filings and investigative reports, funds intended for emergency meal programs were diverted to purchase luxury vehicles, high-end real estate, and expensive jewelry. Some funds were traced to overseas transfers, moving through financial channels into China, East Africa, and Kenya. While families struggled during lockdowns, these networks allegedly lived openly, displaying wealth that drew attention only after the damage was done. The contrast between need and abuse became the emotional core of the case. What intensified public anger was the realization that not a single meal reached the children those programs were designed to help. During a national crisis, trust in public systems was exploited by individuals who understood how to manipulate forms and approvals. Federal investigators argued that this level of deception could not exist without confidence that enforcement would be slow or absent. That belief, they said, was precisely what Operation Metro Surge was meant to destroy. The surge also changed how federal officers interacted with space and movement across the city. Transit hubs, parking structures, and commercial zones were quietly observed, not for spectacle but for pattern recognition. Agents studied routines, vehicle flow, and timing, building a clearer picture of how people moved between work, housing, and informal networks. This methodical pressure made avoidance difficult and mistakes more likely, which is often how larger networks begin to unravel. For residents watching from the sidelines, the operation carried a sense of permanence that earlier enforcement efforts lacked. Patrols returned to the same areas, questions repeated, and federal vehicles reappeared day after day. This persistence signaled that the government was not testing limits, but enforcing them. The slow rhythm of the surge became its own message, reinforcing that time and patience now belonged to the authorities. The Trump administration framed the surge as a necessary response to a pattern that extended beyond fraud alone. Officials described a link between financial crimes, immigration violations, and the protection offered by sanctuary policies. In their view, when enforcement weakens in one area, other forms of crime tend to follow quickly. Minnesota became the testing ground for reversing that trend through direct action. For many residents, the sudden federal presence felt overwhelming, yet for others, it represented long-delayed accountability. Supporters of the operation argued that law-abiding immigrants and citizens had nothing to fear because the targets were those who abused the system for profit. Critics remained unconvinced, warning that trust between communities and authorities was being damaged. The tension between these positions now defines daily life in affected neighborhoods. If you want to follow how federal operations, such as Metro Surge, unfold across the country, subscribe to Military Power for transparent reporting and detailed breakdowns of enforcement actions. And if you live in or near a sanctuary city, share your thoughts in the comments about whether federal intervention restores order or deepens division. As this operation continues to expose the intersection of pandemic fraud and immigration enforcement, the next section will examine how the money trail behind this scandal reveals a network far larger than anyone initially imagined. Federal prosecutors moved quietly but steadily after the initial waves of enforcement began, as courtrooms became the next battleground in a widening campaign. By the time Operation Metro Surge was fully underway, investigators had already secured convictions against 61 individuals tied to a sprawling fraud and abuse network. These cases were built slowly, using financial records, travel data, and internal communications that revealed how the system had been exploited over time. Each conviction added weight to the argument that this was not a series of isolated crimes, but a connected operation that spanned neighborhoods and extended beyond state lines. The scale of the money involved shocked even seasoned investigators. One group alone was found to have diverted $47 million, a figure that reflected not just greed, but also confidence that oversight was weak. Another group moved $3 million in cash, sending it out of the country through both informal and formal channels that avoided early detection. These numbers became anchors in court filings because they showed how quickly small lies could grow into massive theft when controls failed. Federal officials described these figures as markers of reach rather than limits, warning that additional layers remained hidden from view. From the federal perspective, the convictions marked progress, but not closure. Prosecutors stressed that every case opened new leads, new names, and new financial trails. Assets were seized, accounts were frozen, and records were examined line by line to identify who enabled the flow of money. The prevailing belief inside the investigation was that authorities were seeing only the surface because deeper layers still existed. This outlook justified the issuance of expanded warrants, longer timelines, and continued pressure across agencies. Each courtroom success strengthened confidence that persistence would expose remaining actors, even as defense teams attempted to slow momentum through procedural challenges alone. While prosecutors worked through evidence, enforcement teams remained active on the streets before dawn. ICE units returned repeatedly to residential blocks, moving with purpose and restraint. Early hours were chosen because routines were predictable and confusion could be limited. Agents approached homes calmly, secured entrances, and waited for responses rather than forcing immediate confrontations. Vehicles idled nearby, radios stayed quiet, and attention focused on control. The goal was not speed, but certainty, ensuring that targets could not slip away once contact was made. In this phase, patience became the most effective tool available to officers on the ground that morning. In many operations, the individuals sought were already known to authorities through prior criminal records. These visits were based on months of analysis, not chance. Officers positioned themselves carefully, controlling hallways and stairwells while documents were checked. Tension filled small spaces, especially in shared buildings where families and unrelated residents lived. The presence of federal jackets and vehicles instantly altered behavior, as whispers replaced conversation. This measured approach reduced panic, but it also made every movement feel final to those waiting inside. By maintaining order and structure, teams limited chaos and kept situations from spiraling into violence during enforcement actions. Problems arose when agents encountered people who were not part of the original plan. In several locations, individuals living alongside primary targets were found to be in the country illegally. Federal law required action in these cases, even when those individuals were not the focus of the visit. These secondary arrests quickly became symbols for critics, who claimed that enforcement had crossed the line. Supporters responded that ignoring violations would weaken credibility. The situation highlighted the difficulty of separating households and legal status under pressure. Each decision was made on the spot, with limited time and incomplete information, increasing scrutiny from. Tensions escalated further when reports emerged of citizens being temporarily detained during these operations. In crowded residences, confusion and fear made errors more likely, especially when documents were not readily available. Each incident attracted intense attention, fueling criticism from local officials and advocacy groups. Federal agencies acknowledged reviews and corrections, but the headlines traveled faster than clarifications. Trust eroded quickly in affected areas as neighbors questioned motives and methods. The debate shifted from legality to perception, which proved harder to manage than procedure alone. This environment added pressure to officers already operating under scrutiny and stress while faithfully carrying out their orders. Despite backlash, ICE leadership maintained that enforcement priorities remained unchanged. Their positions centered on individuals with criminal histories and clear violations of the law. Allowing known offenders to remain untouched would, in their view, invite further abuse. This resolve hardened as protests grew louder and resistance organized. Officers on the ground felt the weight of national debate during routine actions, knowing that every movement could be recorded. Still, teams followed procedure, believing that consistency would ultimately protect the mission. The streets became quieter, yet tension lingered, shaping interactions between residents and authority each night, after operations ended locally and reports were filed. The arrests led to immediate changes within the affected neighborhoods. Movement slowed, routines shifted, and uncertainty replaced familiarity. Some residents avoided public spaces, while others expressed relief that long-ignored problems were addressed. This divide reflected a broader national struggle over enforcement and safety. For federal planners, discomfort was expected. Criminal networks depend on predictability and silence to survive. Disruption, even when unpopular, was considered essential. Each arrest sent a message that conditions had changed. That signal carried beyond city limits, influencing how similar operations might unfold elsewhere. Minnesota thus became a reference point for future actions and strategies nationwide during enforcement. Prosecutors and agents viewed courtroom victories as reinforcement for field operations. Legal validation reduced hesitation and strengthened coordination. As financial evidence expanded, connections crossed borders and linked associates in unexpected places. Fraud and immigration violations were no longer seen as separate problems. Together, they formed a cycle of cover and profit. Breaking that cycle required patience and authority. The ongoing investigation evolved into a prolonged campaign rather than a swift response. Each step forward revealed additional layers and reinforced the belief that more arrests would follow as pressure continued steadily across systems and jurisdictions over time, without pause or retreat from objectives. The Trump administration publicly supported this combined strategy, arguing that enforcement protected taxpayers and communities. Officials framed the effort as restoration rather than punishment. Convictions were presented as proof that accountability was possible when rules were applied evenly. Supporters responded with approval, seeing action where promises had once stalled. Critics prepared challenges, warning of overreach. This clash hardened political lines. Yet for those executing the plan, momentum mattered more than approval. Results justified continuation. Minnesota became a testing ground for whether sustained pressure could dismantle organized abuse. That outcome would influence decisions elsewhere as similar cases emerged nationwide under review. As federal prosecutions and dawn raids moved forward together, the story entered a more volatile phase. Enforcement was no longer confined to documents or doorways. Public response now shapes outcomes. Demonstrations grew, alliances formed, and political leaders took sides. Each action triggered a reaction, turning operations into symbols of authority and resistance. The legal battle continued, but another confrontation was unfolding outside courtrooms. The next chapter will focus on protests, backlash, and how street pressure threatens to reshape the future of enforcement across sanctuary cities nationwide as federal power meets organized opposition in public view and contested spaces in the near future. The first signs of backlash did not appear in press conferences or court filings, but on cold sidewalks and quiet streets before sunrise. Groups gathered near a hotel believed to be housing federal agents, arriving in the early hours when traffic was light and the city was still asleep. Their presence was loud despite the hour, marked by signs, chants, and voices echoing against glass and concrete. What began as an enforcement operation now spilled into public view, turning sidewalks into contested ground shaped by anger, fear, and defiance. Local police departments responded quickly to contain the situation, forming lines and redirecting traffic to prevent confrontations. Officers from several cities arrived, creating a mix of uniforms and patrol cars around the area. Their task was not to assist federal arrests, but to keep order as emotions rose. The cold air did little to thin the crowd, which held its position long enough to draw the attention of nearby residents watching silently from darkened windows. As news of the protests spread, accusations followed closely behind. Demonstrators claimed that enforcement had crossed moral boundaries, while supporters argued that agents were enforcing laws that had been ignored for too long. The divide sharpened with every passing hour, fueled by phone videos and online commentary. In this environment, perception moved faster than verified facts, and rumor often replaced clarity. The street became a stage where national arguments played out in real time. Tension increased when a city council member announced that more than 400 people had been taken into ICE custody since the surge began. That number quickly spread through the crowd and across social media platforms, becoming a rallying point for critics and a symbol of progress for supporters. For some residents, it confirmed fears of mass enforcement. For others, it suggested long-delayed accountability. Either way, the figure gave weight and shape to an operation that had previously felt distant. Police officers on the ground faced a careful balancing act. They were responsible for public safety while standing between protesters and a federal presence that was largely unseen. Lines were held, instructions repeated, and movements measured as officers worked to prevent escalation. There were no chases or clashes that morning, but the tension was visible in posture and tone. Every step carried the risk of misinterpretation, and restraint became as crucial as authority. Beyond the protest zone, the arrests themselves quietly reshaped daily life across affected neighborhoods. Movement slowed as residents avoided streets and buildings linked to enforcement. Small businesses adjusted hours, and community routines changed in response to uncertainty. The feeling of being observed lingered, altering behavior even when no officers were present. This invisible pressure became one of the most lasting effects of the operation. Supporters of the federal action described the protests as misplaced anger directed at the wrong target. They argued that enforcement only intensified after local systems failed to address clear instances of abuse. From their view, demonstrations were distracted by fraud and criminal behavior that harmed the public. The presence of federal agents was seen as a restoration of order rather than intimidation. For this group, discomfort was a necessary step towards stability. Critics offered a sharply different view, warning that the scale of enforcement risked breaking trust beyond repair. They pointed to families disrupted by arrests and confusion during early morning operations. Stories of mistaken detention circulated widely, reinforcing fears of unchecked authority. These accounts spread quickly, deepening divisions within communities already under stress. But one side called firmness, the other labeled excess. Federal officials responded by maintaining a steady and disciplined message. They emphasized that operations focused on individuals linked to criminal activity and organized abuse. Protests did not alter objectives or timelines. From their perspective, retreat would validate resistance and weaken future enforcement. This resolve shaped decisions across agencies, reinforcing the belief that consistency mattered more than approval. Behind this firm stance was a broader assessment of the threat landscape. Investigators described the fraud network as far larger than first believed, connecting financial crimes with immigration violations and cross-border money movement. These elements were not separate issues, but parts of a single structure. Weak oversight in one area provided cover in another, allowing networks to grow quietly until exposure became unavoidable. This understanding drove the decision to continue and expand enforcement efforts. Federal planners warned that if the pattern observed in Minnesota went unchecked, it could appear in other states. Sanctuary policies were viewed as openings that organized groups learned to exploit. Stopping this cycle required more than arrests alone. It demanded tighter control over systems that had been manipulated for years. As a result, the campaign evolved from a short-term response to sustained pressure. Financial oversight tightened, coordination increased, and information moved more freely between agencies. Each arrest and each protest informed the next phase of action. The objective was not only to dismantle an existing network, but to prevent its return under a different name. This long view explained why operations continued despite public resistance. For residents caught between enforcement and protest, daily life became marked by uncertainty. Streets that once felt familiar now carried the weight of national attention. Conversations at work and at home revolved around raids, custody numbers, and demonstrations. Fear, relief, and anger mixed in unpredictable ways, shaping decisions large and small. The city lived with consequences shaped far beyond local control. The Trump administration framed this moment as a test of federal resolve. Officials argued that backing down would invite further abuse and encourage similar networks elsewhere. Minnesota became a signal to other regions, showing how federal authority would respond when systems failed. Protests were viewed not as deterrence, but as signs that pressure was having its intended effect. Visibility meant exposure, and exposure forced change. As weeks passed, the immediate noise of demonstrations began to fade, but their impact remained. Arrests continued, investigations deepened, and political fallout widened. What started as a local response to fraud transformed into a national example of enforcement in action. The results would shape future decisions on how and where similar operations would unfold. The following section will examine how these developments may impact broader immigration policy and federal strategy nationwide in the months ahead. What unfolded in Minnesota did not begin with protests or arrests, but with a quiet fraud committed during a national crisis, when money meant to feed children was redirected into private hands. That fraud opened a door, and through that door came Operation Metro Surge, a federal response that treated the problem as structural rather than accidental. From early morning enforcement actions to sustained ICE raids, the pressure expanded outward, touching neighborhoods, homes, and daily routines. As arrests mounted, public reaction followed, first in anger, then in fear, and finally in open confrontation on the streets. What began as a financial crime investigation evolved into a visible struggle over authority, order, and control. The Trump administration made its position clear through action rather than rhetoric. This was no longer viewed as an administrative failure or a paperwork issue, but as a domestic security threat built from fraud, illegal immigration, and cross-border money movement. Federal planners treated these elements as part of a single system, where weak enforcement in one area created a loophole in another. From that perspective, stepping back was never an option, because retreat would allow the same pattern to repeat elsewhere. Minnesota now stands as a test case. It illustrates how quickly local problems can garner national attention when systems are abused for an extended period. It also shows how federal authority responds when it believes state and city leadership have lost control. Whether welcomed or resisted, the message was sent through sustained enforcement and continued investigations. If you want to stay informed about how federal operations like this unfold across the country, subscribe to Military Power for transparent reporting and detailed breakdowns. And now, a question worth asking as this story continues. Do you believe Minnesota is only the beginning of a broader federal campaign that could soon reach other states across the United States?